I had accumulated over 70 different signs and symptoms. I had basically been at that point where I was bedridden, and I was in the utmost level of like chronic fatigue to where like I couldn't get out of bed. And this was an individual who was very involved in sports and willing himself to basically navigate, because that's all I had, right? You can understand all I had was the mind, because I was disembodied. I was dissociated because my body never was allowed to be mapped with my nervous system.
Welcome to the Rock Bottom Podcast, presented by Jigsaw Health, where we share health horror stories that inspire. Today's guest nearly died in 2024 due to a complete thyroid failure. But what's most remarkable is what didn't break: his mind. After hitting rock bottom with autoimmune thyroid failure, he found healing outside of conventional medicine and made it his mission to help others do the same.
Before we dive in, just a quick note, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and it isn't a substitute for medical advice, so please always consult with a healthcare professional before making any changes to your health routine.
So let's get to it. This is the Rock Bottom Podcast. Dr. Wes Kress, we are so excited to talk to you today. Let's jump right in. Let's start with your rock bottom and tell us what was happening in your mind and your body in 2024 when essentially your health started to crash.
Yeah, so I think this would help by prefacing a little bit about what I will be speaking about and on in terms of the nature of the difference between knowledge and self-knowledge, because that distinction is probably one of the most important things in terms of talking about what we're talking about today. Knowledge is sort of the acquirement of everything in terms of the nature of the content of reality. And a lot of us are hyper fixated on the nature of knowledge. And a lot of my journey sort of required me to go inward, which is the discovery of self-knowledge. And a good way of understanding this in terms of a visual description is if we were watching a movie and the content on the projector would be sort of knowledge. And that content could change, but the actual projector, which is the understanding of the self, and is described in terms of self-knowledge through all of wisdom traditions in terms of know thyself, is what led me to understand the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality, and some of the bigger questions. And the question that allowed me to go deeper was, why do we ask that question? You know, I don't think people think about like, why do we ask that question? They just ask the question.
Right.
And the reason we ask...
Which question? Why do we ask what question?
Why do we ask the question of the nature of like, what is all of this? What is the universe? What is God? What is
Why
the
are we
nature
here?
of reality?
Yeah.
Why are we here?
The big question?
The big questions.
Okay.
Yeah, why do we ask those questions? And I think that preface is something very important, that there's something within our experience that doesn't seem to be quite right. Yeah. And that is a lot of what I discovered along my journey of healing, is that that experience is what we are trying to understand. And the only way to understand it is to actually understand self-knowledge. And that is really the understanding of the projector, and that is the self. So what is the self? Essentially, it is your thoughts, it is your beliefs, it is your emotions, it is your sensations, it's your lenses of perceptions, it's your conditioning, it's your trauma, it's your past experiences. And all of that shapes how you experience knowledge, right?
It's all your prior experiences, everything.
Yes, and those prior experiences are shaped by your survival, right? So they're a requirement for you being able to survive. So whatever the conditioned self is, some people call this the egoic structure. The conditioned self is sort of what many traditions call as the false self, because it's the self that's necessary to be able to survive within the dynamic of a family or a tribe. And so we acquire all of these, what we consider as like personalities, in order to fit within that dynamic. And we practice it so well that, and we don't know we're practicing it until we get to the formation of the self, and then we feel like something is not quite right.
So where were you with all of this in 2024 when you had your, essentially near-death experience, would you call it?
Yeah, so the 2024 component was actually definitely not a rock bottom. It was actually an illumination into the nature of rock bottom, which really occurred at 19. And I would say that the rock bottom is really this nature of where sort of our experience of reality shifts from this external dissociation into this internal truth of what is being blocked by the egoic structure. So it's all the things that we haven't been able to actually process from the past that we're carrying in the present, and we don't know that we're carrying them. And it's sort of like the landscape of a computer, right? Your computer has windows that are open, and for every window that's open, you sort of don't close it until you process it. And so the more windows that you have open, right, the more energy that is being required in terms of the RAM of the computer to actually suppress those prior emotions that are unprocessed, those prior experiences. And that is all the conditioned self. And so when you hit rock bottom, the nature of rock bottom is where that energy equation no longer has the capacity to hold those unconscious experiences, which are held in the body, down any further. You could say you've been forcing a beach volleyball down far enough into the ocean that at some point the pressure just is not able to go any further, and it comes back the other direction.
Yeah. I love those analogies. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think we can all sense this, right? And much of the nature of sensing is that truth isn't something that we arrive at in the mind, right? And I think that, again, going back to the preface of this conversation, is that knowledge is something that we believe we can arrive at in terms of truth. But the mind is a conduit to truth, which is actually a direct experience in the body. And that is the truth we're seeking. But
So are you saying what we think about in our mind becomes the experience in our body?
Actually, it can be. It's a two-way street, right? In terms of the nature of the mind can create conditioning. That's sort of where the false self sort of arises from, is that the mind sort of is clinging on to the nature of some identification of reality as a formation of something to feel safe with. And it does so in a way to help us navigate a reality that we could not possibly navigate all at once, right? So none of these things are inherently right or wrong or good or bad. It's more or less a framework of understanding so that we can navigate the nature of the self and the nature of reality with less suffering. And eventually, to speak to your point, at age 24, it was the full culmination of understanding of the distinction between the nature of liberation and the nature of the physical self in terms of sickness, or in that case where I was basically came completely off a thyroid hormone and I had undetectable T3 levels and undetectable T4 levels, and of course a TSH over 420. I did this all knowingly.
You did it on purpose. You decided one day, I'm just going to go off of my thyroid medication and see what happens?
Yes. So there's a couple things, and I would say that we can sort of speak to this point. We can go back to the beginning and then arrive back here. But at 29, when I had done blood work, I had discovered I was already in complete thyroid failure and had been since I was 19. And I had an inborn genetic sort of mutation called thyroid dyshormogenesis 6, where it doesn't actually allow you to synthesize T4, which is sort of the inactive form of thyroid hormone. And so...
Meaning it doesn't allow you to convert it into...
Not convert it, synthesize it.
So what do you mean by that?
To use it,
to create it.
You can't. So your body's not making T4, and you need T4 in order for it to get converted to T3, the active form.
Correct.
So your body, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, was saying, hey, we need more thyroid, but your thyroid or your pituitary was not making T4. What wasn't making the T4?
Yeah, so the T4 comes from the thyroid gland.
Okay.
And yeah, so the TSH is actually a signal from the pituitary.
Yes.
And so the TSH was fine. And the reason is like when I was born with this. I also later was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, and that furthered the acceleration of this process. But essentially, I was born congenitally with hypothyroidism. And so
Yeah.
I was hypothyroid
Your whole life.
my whole life up
Yeah.
until recently. And so this is part of the study of consciousness and reality, is that the nature of the physical self in terms of the breakdown is the portal at which we experience emotional and spiritual healing. So, and we've seen this through indigenous cultures and so forth, where basically they'll do fasting or they'll do sort of sleep deprivation to bring up the emotional states, or long meditations for days or weeks as a way of breaking down the body so that there's less energy to hold down those unconscious aspects which we were referring to earlier in the body itself. And the reason that they're so necessary to come up and to be felt and processed is the amount of energy that's required to maintain those open windows, right? Without your attention and awareness going towards them. And so there's this active sort of like energy depletion that's going on beneath the nature of consciousness that is affecting all the physical systems of the body. And I would say, from my estimations going through this process and coming on the other end, in my experience, is about 70 to 75%. And again, it's hard to give those numbers. Those are all just a direct experience, numerical value. But that's how much of the energy processes that are directed towards these unprocessed emotions, experiences, lenses of perceptions, beliefs, and so forth that make up the conditioned self, which is, you could say, a nervous system that's programmed with a somatic suit and a VR goggles that we're all experiencing reality. And so most of us basically start to experience this and we realize, oh, look at all these things that are wrong with reality, right? And
Like health issues that arise.
yes, health issues that arise as a result of that. They, and this is why there's such a strong relationship. And I'll speak to some of the research around this in terms of like ACEs, or adverse childhood events, which was the largest systemic review that was done on childhood trauma. And that was done, I think, in the 80s or the 90s. And it just looked at a score that they created as a methodology to evaluate certain events or experiences that a child would have that counted towards the significance of an event that would cause a change in the nervous system, so much and so significantly in the brain and nervous system that it altered your experience of that same content. Right? So you and I may be having in the same nature of reality, and you're having an entirely different experience than I am.
Right.
Right? And I think we can all kind of agree upon this, yet we don't really fully experience this as a truth day to day. We think we are all having sort of the same experience, right? And this is so far from accurate, right? And sometimes the ends of the spectrum help us understand the middle. And so these extremes are very insightful in terms of helping us know these aspects of insight. Insight is the nature of inward looking, the sight turning inward to have an understanding of what's actually taking place versus what we think is taking place. And that is this exploration into the self and self-knowledge. And part of this came about through my sort of upbringing. So I was born into a cult religion called the 2x2s, which recently had done a show on Hulu, which sort of went into depth. But it was sort of this underground cult religion that's worldwide. I say underground, they managed to stay out of the sort of domain of the internet for almost the last 35 years, right, that the internet's been around, without anyone really being able to point to anything. They didn't have necessarily a structure like an LLC. So there was no sort of entity that you could point to, yet this is a worldwide billions of dollar organization that was founded in the late 1800s. And they are recently being investigated by the FBI for a lot of what I experienced in terms of the nature of sexual trauma and sexual abuse from a very young age, from about age 4 to age 13. And that sort of set the framework in terms of like my path of devotion towards understanding these bigger questions. And I think the reason we ask these questions and the reason why we even contemplate them is because of pain, right?
Definitely.
And so largely emotional pain, but physical pain interplays with that as well. But the emotional pain asks us to ask these questions. And that's why we ask, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of consciousness? Is there a God? Is there some sort of grand plan in terms of the nature of the experience?
Why are we here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it's kind of like if you had back pain, everything in terms of your world starts to architect around the nature of avoiding interaction with that pain.
Yeah.
Right? So you start thinking about, how do I do this activity different? How do I do that?
How do I fix it? Who do I go
Yes.
see? What kind of specialists?
Yes. And the moment that back pain goes away, the question doesn't pertain, right? You don't ask the question. Like, I don't sit here and I have back pain and I go like, how should I design my life?
Right.
Right? Like, it doesn't make any sense to formulate that question if there's no pain.
So pain makes us ask the questions. So obviously, you have a very long history since a very young child of having all of that trauma. Are you saying that all those years of trauma finally caught up to you about the age of 19 when you started to experience in the physical body these health issues?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that the nature of my understanding from working with a lot of people, both clinically and my own experience, that it likely not only started with me, but the lineage before me in terms of the generations of generational trauma that gets passed down through the nervous system. Our nervous systems are passing information, right? It's like,
So you're saying we can inherit, or we do inherit trauma from our ancestors, our parents, their parents, and just like we inherit specific genes, we inherit trauma in the nervous system?
absolutely, absolutely.
Wow.
And there's actually a lot of data in science to actually support this. And I would say that it's not only that we just inherit it, of course, there is that component, but there is a tremendous amount of mirror learning, right? Like, you can't possibly connect with your child in the ways that you weren't connected with. You just don't know what you don't know,
Right.
right? So we connect in those ways, right? Which the ways we've been connected with.
Right.
And so there's already this sort of aspect of the emotional development and the nervous system development are very closely intertwined. And so without addressing the unprocessed emotions, we can possibly master the nervous system. It's,
Right. And we are not taught in our culture, and I certainly wasn't taught about how to process emotions in a way. I mean, I think that we were kind of just taught like, hey, like, get over it,
Rub some dirt on it.
Yes.
walk it off, just literally get over it. Don't think about it, and that's when I think that's why people end up in these situations, that they've kind of tucked things away under the rug, and thought, well, they're going away. If I don't think about it, it's not there. But the body begs to differ.
Yes. And in fact, at 19, the body was speaking louder than the mind.
So take us back to that. What was happening to you physically?
Yeah, so physically, I started to experience, I was sort of born ill, and obviously going back, and I know so much now versus then, and I've kind of gone through this whole process. So I'm trying to fill in some gaps that I did and didn't know to give a full picture. But ultimately, at age 4, as the formation of consciousness and thoughts, there was already like this brewing dissonance of like what my inner experience was versus this sort of external reality. And by the time I was age 7, I would liken it to the fact that if someone had ever experienced like a break-in into their home, right? And things were just super chaotic. It felt like there was tremendous betrayal and distrust and like this sense of uneasiness and disorientation and fear. that essentially that's what was being experienced in this heightened level of magnitude in terms of the nature at 7 years old. And again, this was this culmination and accumulation of the trauma. And as I was trying to understand, you're sort of looking out into the nature of reality for, is this just how things are, or am I experiencing something different? And crazy enough, I actually am an identical twin, and I have a mirror twin. And I do attribute a lot of the nature of my path to having that anchor point, is being able to see something that was just like you and start to reflect back to you, right? A lot of our own healing and growth comes from the nature of mirrors. And so we look into the nature of reality and we start to see parts of ourselves in others, or we see portions of ourselves that we like or we don't like and reject, or we basically want to expand within ourselves. So there's healthy mirrors, there's unhealthy mirrors, but at the end of the day, they're insights into the nature of the self, the greater self. And so all of this was giving way in terms of the nature of like understanding this sort of culmination of this false self, which was forming within myself as a way of survival. And the weaponization of the 2x2s was a lot to do with repression and silencing and fear. And there was no sense of like, meeting myself or anyone there where they were at and trying to provide understanding and clarity. It was a matter of confusion and pain. That is the nature of a power structure and a dynamic that's meant to continue on in its own sake of survival. And so that is where at age 9, I essentially had come across a book by Dr. Hawkins called Power vs. Force. And
Sorry, say that again?
I had come across a book called Power vs. Force by Dr. Hawkins.
Power
It was,
versus Force.
Yeah, one of the first books written on consciousness that was laid out the way it was laid out. Sort of goes through the spectrum of consciousness as a scale and sort of lists all the different emotions and so forth. And at 9 years old, of course, like, you can only understand so much. And so the framework at which I was grasping that was limited and extremely limited compared to what I understand now from a direct embodied experience of that.
How did you get your hands on this book, living in this cult? I'm surprised that book was available.
Yeah, so I would say that the nature of like my family's involvement with that cult came with an interesting dynamic, right? There was some aspects of like compliance, and there were some aspects of like openness. So it was meant to sort of like, I would say that my parents, the way my father was, he sort of was like very much into health from a fear-based standpoint. His own father died of brain cancer when he was, I believe, 7 years old. So it had like huge implications of which he didn't know, and parts of himself that are likely still very, very disconnected as a result of having that significant level of trauma at such an early age. And so he was in some ways like fixated on the nature of like health. And so there was areas of like openness. And yet at the same time, my mother, who was very much led down this path of being in a cult, came from a path of growing up with a mother that was an alcoholic and, a father that also struggled with that. And there was a lot of insecurity. And the one thing about a cult is that a community and a cult are on the same spectrum. They just happen to be distorted, right? So a cult really gives you this sense of belonging, but it's also in the sense of control.
Yes.
It's kind of like the nature of relationship romantically, right? You can be in one that's symbiotic or parasitic with a power dynamic, or you can be in one that's very much allowing you to experience and express the nature of your autonomy and agency, and then coming together and actually enjoying the expression of love, both individually, but then together, right?
Yeah.
It's just, healing is really about the nature of relationship to self, relationship to others, relationship to the world. So that's why at the end, everything changes, but nothing changes, meaning your experience of everything changes, but nothing changed. Meaning
The only change
fundamentally,
that was made was inside of you.
correct. And that is the nature of why most religious or spiritual contexts talk about the nature that the kingdom of heaven is within. And they were using these sort of concepts And I think if you sort of walk down this path of self-knowledge, that it's sort of like science leads you to the divine. It's impossible not to.
Right. So you get this book, The Force versus Power, or Power versus Force?
Yeah, Power versus Force.
Power versus Force. At 9 years old, you read it, you start to get more curious and think to yourself, this makes a lot more sense. So what did you do then?
So I think, so at that point in time, it sort of opened things. And I always say, like, the nature of healing is you basically have to move beyond the mind. So you have to be open and curious and willing and committed. I would say at that point I was open and curious.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that the willingness or the commitment in terms of what I knew wasn't there until later.
I mean, yeah, 9 years old is a little early, but that was kind of the first seed that was planted.
Yes. And so what happened at that point was I started studying different theologies, so different religions, different philosophies, and trying to understand, engage, like, okay, what if I was born into the Taliban and like this radical Islamic religion, like I would probably believe the way I believe in this, right? And so I started asking those questions and the formation of self. And so then I started following different religions, like actually inherently taking on their beliefs, taking on the nature and investing a lot of energy into the nature of that. And I started to realize, like, oh, wow, like this is the same thing in a different way.
Yeah.
And this leads me back to the same thing of just pointing back to the processor, right? The nature of the content had changed here, but consciousness was absolutely the same, right? I was just shape-shifting from one thing to the other. And this can happen among anything, right? You can take religious content, which is like the very nature of what I experienced growing up in that cult 2x2, which portrayed itself as like the truth, the way, and yet at the same time, like it was at a very low level of consciousness, right? The projector wasn't there, and yet for someone who didn't know thyself, you're easily deceived into the nature of like, this is the way. And so most of the nature of this led me to question, like, if those aren't the truth and I'm shift-shaping into these different aspects of religion and theology and philosophy and then investing and they start to be experienced as truth, how do I arrive there? And so that was what led me to the nature of when I was 16. And so at 16, I happened to come across a book called The Four Agreements. Many people are aware of this book, and by Don Miguel Ruiz. And it was the first time I sort of was like, oh, this is interesting, right? It sort of had principles, but not necessarily religious dogma.
Right.
And I was kind of like curious, read the book, kind of, you can start to experience what that might be like through the nature of imagination of the mind. But that's also just a layer of conditioning, right? So I realized, like, okay, well, how do I actually become that? Like, how do I experience that to where that is my everyday experience, not this sort of like transient, like I imagine that to be that way.
Or just like this constant search to be relieved of the pain.
Correct. And that's the whole path, right?
Yeah.
Like it's this nature of like inquiring both into the nature of reality, the nature of phenomena in terms of emotions, sensations, thoughts, experience, and meaning, and why that all matters. And so that's why these questions are in many ways relevant at all. And so that led me to one of Don Miguel Ruiz's mentees, which he mentored, which his name is Gary Van Warmerdam. And he wrote a book called Mindworks later, after I had sort of discovered his website and engaged a lot with his content, and he had 2 self-mastery courses that were basically geared around self-knowledge. And it was the actual principles of engaging with what we consider as self-inquiry, meaning self-inquiry is the nature of questioning the self and understanding these principles of, who am I? And that leads you to these sort of understandings of different archetype characters. So these archetype characters are kind of like roles that we take on in the formation of our family unit. And some of these have been expanded on in terms of internal family systems, in terms of recent content, and so forth. And that very much shapes our nervous system, right? Like anyone can understand like the magnitude of these things. If, you have a conversation right before you're about to eat, that stops your appetite. That's
Right.
more potent than any drug or supplement. But what happened there was that the same physical processes that digest your past experiences are the same things that digest your food. It's just really hard to digest certain things in reality.
Yeah.
Right? And the nature of understanding of that is largely rooted in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, which came later in my depths of understanding self-knowledge and the self, and actually how do you resolve sort of these things at every level.
Yes, that's what I want to know.
Yes.
I think we
yes.
all want to know, right?
Yes, yeah. I know the furthest end of like sort of self-development is self-dissolution, which is sort of like the paradox of all aspects of like performance, right? Is like we sort of have this formation of the self, we practice really strongly, but like the ultimate level of mastery is the flow state. It's when you sort of aren't sort of constrained by this contracted state of trying to be, but you're just are. Right? And in order to get to that experience in perpetuity, we sort of have to know the self so well that the illusions of separation fall away.
And that's what happened for you. And I'm trying to put together the timeline a little bit. So it's like you started to learn all these things. You were beginning the work. You were starting to understand. But then you still had this massive physical breakdown. I'm kind of curious, and I don't want to jump too much ahead, but what was the catalyst to you being able to have this, let's call it an enlightened moment where, because, spoiler alert, you almost died, but like, although you were going through this physical breakdown, your mind never felt like you were breaking down mentally. Is that right?
Yeah. And so to speak to the point of which you're speaking to is like this point of when I had that physical breakdown was about 2 years after my experience of liberation. So that's why it's maybe a little bit confusing, because rock bottom came at 19, which was about 15 years prior to that experience. And so one of the aspects in terms of like the timeline is, so at 16, I started to understand these sort of aspects of self-knowledge. But physically, from all of the sexual trauma, the sort of false beliefs about the nature of the self, and all of the constraints of these belief structures that are extremely rigid. I mean, the nature of the 2x2 was like so much in belief that like everyone outside of it, right, was going to a lost eternity, and we had specialized knowledge. So you could understand the nature of separation, right, to not just the nature of like reality, but the nature of other individuals, right? Because that's what it believed.
Yeah.
And so that became a very unconscious but lived experience of identity within the self, the conditioned self that I was experiencing. And so I continue to acquire both from the physical components of these traumas happening, but also what ended up happening was the expression of autoimmune disease as a result of all of this. So by the time I was 19, I had accumulated over 70 different signs and symptoms.
Of autoimmune disease?
So symptoms
Or
and
just,
so about
all
4
over the
different
place.
autoimmune diseases, but 70
Yeah.
different signs and symptoms. And I
That's a
had
lot.
basically been at that point where I was bedridden, and I was in the utmost level of like chronic fatigue to where like I couldn't get out of bed. And this was an individual who was very involved in sports and willing himself to basically navigate, because that's all I had, right? You can understand all I had was the mind, because I was disembodied. I was
Right.
dissociated because my body never was allowed to be mapped with my nervous system, because my nervous system had too much trauma. And so in many ways, the mind was protecting it.
Yeah.
But by a result of that, that required so much energy. And so all of this unconscious beliefs and unconscious trauma and had culminated to where my body was speaking way louder than my mind. And so I had acquired all this information, this knowledge from studying all these different things, studying about health since I was very, very young. And yet I came to this realization that like information doesn't equal transformation,
Right.
and that the nature of the mind, no matter how much you believe, isn't going to lead you to that experience. In fact, it's the reverse, right? It's a letting go of all the things in the nature of the mind to arrive back at a remembrance of the wholeness of the untouched self, which we all are before this conditioned self actually formulates. And so,
So it's like the original programming that we're born with
Yes.
before we get the downloads.
yeah, it's the innocence of a child that many traditions speak of, and we can sort of kind of go back, at least for people who didn't have super early trauma, and have this understanding of this freedom, right? It's like this childlike experience of play, enjoyment. It's not like children aren't doing things. They absolutely are, but their experience of it is very different. The nature of the sort of formation of the false self. It's like, oh, I got to do this. I got to get myself up, pull myself up, put all this will, this energy, this contraction, and it's like your experience of the nature of reality in the world vastly shifts,
Yeah.
right? As you sort of take on this conditioning. And the more that the physical body depletes, the stronger the mind has to become in response, right? So then we're like basically doing the same domestication process, which Don Miguel Ruiz talks about, that leads to the formation of the false self, which is self-betrayal in the desire of surviving in the nature of our tribe, which is our family. So we forego anything that would be needed in terms of emotional needs, physical, whatever it is, so that we can survive. And everyone's different in terms of the formation of their family and so forth. But that is why we sort of don't know what we don't know. And depending on the degree of magnitude of this from early life and then lineage past, all of that builds up to a point where then you're like forced into it. Not because like, oh, I was the chosen one that like I had to. It was like it got to a breaking point where the volcano exploded, right? And that was the body screaming. And then I stopped. I couldn't go any further.
Yeah, you were literally bedridden. Your body had to get you to that place for you to finally break, essentially.
Yes. And that is the representation of what many people, I would say, describe as rock bottom. Right? It's where the energy of the mind is no longer stronger than the energy of all of the trauma and repressed emotions that become explosive. And so that basically caused you to start to experience everything in a much clearer way, and a way that gives you a doorway into opening, right? And what I say is that openness and curiosity, there were two required pieces, and then the willingness, right, and the commitment are sort of the other things, right? The willingness is like the need to like actually go with the process, and the commitment is to stay with it, because this process is multifaceted, but it is also like you're going to fall back, right? Like that's just part of the process. Like everything that's in motion stays in motion. And so in many ways, the sort of survival evolutionary path is in opposition to the spiritual and wholeness path, right? So what helps us heal and become whole isn't what helps us survive. And that's why it's so hard.
Hold on, let's think about that for a second. What helps us to heal is not necessarily... What did you say?
What helps us to heal is not what helps us
to survive.
Correct.
Because
Hold
what
on.
helps us to survive is the mind, right?
Yes, the mind is a result of a survival mechanism.
So in order to heal, you have to get out of the mind and shut down close some windows down, essentially.
Yes. You have to come back into the body where all of the unprocessed things of the past are there.
That's heavy.
It's deep.
This
yes.
conversation is definitely that way.
Okay, so how? How do you get out of the mind into the body?
How did you
Is
do
that
it?
the right question? Am I asking? Am I phrasing it the
You're
right
absolutely
way?
asking the right question. And, I think that the nature of the start of that is really where we look at the framework for sort of self-knowledge, right? And so a lot of that starts with two primary qualities, which is attention and awareness. So a lot of times, these practices will be in the nature of meditation, or being able to, if you sit with yourself, you start to realize like, oh, wow, like I sat down here to meditate, and before you know it, less than seconds later, my attention was in some story of the mind or some emotion or thing I have to do. And you realize like how elusive the nature of presence is when we have so much from the past that is occurring in the present that we don't have the opportunity to process unless we're present with it. And when I say present with it, you have to have space. So meditation just creates the space. It's sort of the conduit. It's not like a required, it's a required mechanism to this process, meaning like the doorway at which allows us to begin the nature of understanding the fulcrum, which is the attention. And awareness, attention and awareness are sort of different. Attention is like if you're focused on a conversation that we're having and in the background, the refrigerator sort of humming noise is going on, your attention may have completely blocked out that piece of awareness.
Okay.
Right? So all you're sort of focused on is the noise of my voice. And this is a primary survival mechanism so that we focus on anything, right? In terms of our attention. And then the awareness is essentially everything that's happening simultaneously, right? Meaning all the sensory inputs that could be happening within any given domain of experience. And the first way to sort of start to understand how to train the attention is to first understand its nature, right? And so meditation is that beginning process, and there's really two types of meditation. Yeah.
Its nature is to, well, for me, bounce around and think about a million things when I'm really, really working to try and not think about those things. Then you recognize how difficult this is because of the program that we run all the time. It's like, that's just how we live our lives. You know, we aren't taught to be quiet or to be still or to just like take time away from all those thoughts and try and get into the body and just like have that experience and like allow things to, I don't know.
No, you're saying it accurately.
I am. Okay.
Yes.
So when you were bedridden and all of these things, basically the volcano exploded for you. What was your first step to liberation, to healing at that point?
Yeah. So one thing is I never thought of the word liberation until 2 years ago. I don't even know if I ever spent much time on it. I was just in such a degree of suffering. And so I think I was trying to alleviate the nature of suffering. And I sort of like up until 19, all I was doing was I felt like I was getting worse and worse. And yet I was, again, intellectually trying
You were learning so many things.
To navigate things in terms of at the layer of the mind. But I really hadn't been broken open into the nature of sort of like what was beneath the nature of the mind. And there was many reasons for that, like our greatest strengths, our greatest weakness. So there's a lot of literature around people that tend to like very much gravitate to academia and so forth as like intellectual pursuits may have like a higher proclivity or predisposition to like mental health or mental health disease. And the reason that is just because like the mind is in part designed in a way that like the more we know, the more we suffer until we become embodied, right? So embodiment is the nature of processing those things so that they integrate. And this is a lot to do with the nature of going back to the framework of sort of self-knowledge is like the shadow work, right? Shadow work, what is shadow work and what are parts work, which we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, is that shadow work is essentially the things that we are operating below the nature of the surface of our direct consciousness that are driving a lot of our behaviors, either in avoidance or in non-avoidance, meaning direct engagement as avoidance, meaning pleasure seeking, or in the nature of avoidance that allows us not to touch on the pain of the past. That's why the mind can't lead us to healing, is because the mind is a survival strategy actually created to avoid emotional pain.
Hold on. The mind is a survival strategy created to avoid emotional pain.
Yes.
So the mind comes up with ways to
Block
anyway
the
to ignore the emotional pain.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's as a result because of the nature of like, if you're in pain, what's your first thing to do? Like physical pain.
Solve it.
Yeah, to get rid of it.
Comfortable. Yeah.
Right?
I mean,
we have this
usually
like,
ice and elevation, I feel like that's the...
yeah, the majority of people will try to solve the nature of avoidance of pain. We just happen to have this built in relationship to emotional pain, right? And I'm speaking in terms of the mind predominantly as an identity, right? In terms of the formation of this sort of false self, or you could say conditioned self, and many people speak to this as the egoic structure, which is slightly different than the nature of the mind as a utility. So the mind as a utility is a formation of communication. And that's what the healthy part of the mind is designed for. It's sort of what many philosophical traditions say is like the mind's like not really a great leader. It's a great passenger seat, but like most of us are leading with our mind, not our heart and our body.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where like the problem is. Like we don't know that until we actually start to unwind.
Well, we're
this
actually
process.
taught to live that way, to function that way. To
It's
lead
a
with the mind.
requirement of sort of like I say requirement. It's like it's a natural process of evolution, right? Is to survive.
Survive, yeah.
Right? And it just so happens that that is why we're sort of like, to speak from a broader landscape, is that I think we're at like this sort of pivot point in the collective. And you can sort of see this. And what I mean by that is that we're sort of in the digital information age. And a lot of the diseases that are present in terms of mental health and physical autoimmune are largely pretty present for what is happening now. And many people point to sort of this like theoretical and conceptual knowledge of like the nature of how reality has changed in terms of industrialization and food processing and pesticides and all of these things are somewhat accurate. It's not to say that these things are not accurate, but I would just say that the bigger landscape of change that has taken place in terms of the way the nervous system is impacted by reality is that the majority of us are largely in the navigation of reality through the mind. And you couldn't do that historically, right? If I were to drop you into the nature of like the outdoors and sort of you would have to survive, you would be forced into mapping the nature of your attention in the body to survive because your sensory system would have to be heightened in development in order to actually navigate that from a survival standpoint. So we've shifted much faster from a technological standpoint than we have in terms of like this component inside. And so that's why I think in many ways we're going through a collective awakening to these understandings. And it's this sort of unconscious process that's being forged. And why people are starting to ask all these questions is simply because people are in a lot of pain, right? Emotionally. And mental health is significantly higher than it's ever been. And I would say that the sort of access to modern day things are a lot different than they were hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right? Much less thousands of years ago. And so how is it that all these modern conveniences have led to more suffering? And that question is like, is more of our suffering emotional in nature from what we are discussing today than they are physical? And how much of that is actually giving way to all of this? And of course, they're all playing. This is not to create this idea that it is all emotional. There are both interplaying. They're not separate. They're directly interacting together. It's just the order of magnitude at which that relationship is taking place. And I think most people can experience this, right? Like if you go and train for a marathon physically, you know, the day after the marathon, you might take a day or a few days or maybe even a week to recover. But, you know, you recover pretty quickly. But if you have a loss of a loved one, you have an emotional heartbreak with someone significant, you may never recover, right?
Because it's stuck in the body.
Yes. And that you could imagine, right, the change that's taking place in that landscape inside in order to avoid that pain.
So what happens to your nervous system in that case?
The nervous system tends to have a sort of like heightened response to these things that tend to continue on, that give way or detract from the nature of quality of life. So what we see in sort of like these both adverse childhood events that shape the brain nervous system from early on or from later events is that the brain changes as a result of that unprocessed trauma. So we have heightened levels of the amygdala, which is sort of that fear response, keeping us in that fight or flight, or even sort of moving back and forth from fight or flight to freeze or dorsal vagal response, which is like a fawn. And people don't know that's happening. And they're using the mind to, of course, navigate the dysfunction of the body. So you're like, oh, I've got to get this done. And we may use other things as a result of that to help us through that. And there are certainly healthier coping mechanisms and unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? Like healthy coping mechanism and even a healing mechanism would be exercise and physical activity. But like unhealthy coping mechanisms would be like drugs, right? But like, why do we use drugs?
To escape.
Escape, right? Escape the nature of what?
The pain.
Exactly, the emotional pain. And so most of us are fixated on this sort of like endpoint, right? Meaning that like, oh, the drugs are the problem. But are they the problem? Like, yeah, of course they are part of the problem, and they become an increasingly part of the problem the more we use them.
Right. But it's like,
right?
why did you start to use it in the first place? Let's address that.
Exactly. And I would say that there's a nature of relativity, meaning that the people who are predisposed to these things, sure, there's some genetic components, some genetic variants and other things that predispose you. But the bigger picture is like how much of your nervous system is experiencing reality in a way that is closer to reality versus your perception of reality from all your past experience of emotional pain, your trauma, your conditioning. And I would just say that the people that are actually usually the ones using those drugs have found a coping mechanism that helps stop that. It also stops the progress of any development and integration that can take place, and it creates a lot more problems because you're actually damaging the very system, the physical systems that help us process these emotions. That's why you have a double-edged sword, right? It's like you sort of needed it because you were trying to sort of step over a dollar to pick up a penny, that you didn't realize that it gave you a little bit of the glimpse of what you remembered, which was this pain-free state of expansion and openness. I mean, most people on the drugs.
When you were a child.
Yes, exactly.
So when you ended up getting, better, right? So you're no longer bedridden, you're starting to make progress, you're doing all of these things to get back to self, to be, to close down the programs on the computer that are running and taking so much energy, but to actually truly heal from the inside, like maybe would you call it like on a soul level? What do you do now? I know that you help many people with these types of things and you help them through their, like you vowed, hey, I was able to get through this myself. I want to help. I want to spend my life helping people. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you do that?
Yes. I think the nature of understanding this component, at least for myself and the engagement of what I do, is largely from one aspect that we can only have if we go through something, right? It's like, no matter how good that a basketball analyst on TV understands basketball, he still doesn't understand what it's like to be the athlete itself, because there's so many nuances of experience that go into the actual process, which can only happen if you actually go through it. Right? Like if you and I
experience.
Yeah, if we sat here, right, and we studied snowboarding for the next 2 years and we knew everything conceptually, and 2 years came around, how good would we be at snowboarding?
Probably not that great.
Yeah, exactly. So the nature of this is like...
We would be very smart beginners.
Yes. And I would say a lot of integrative medicine and like sort of natural medicine is born out of direct experience.
Yeah.
Right?
What works?
Yes. I mean, if you ask, I remember being...
Because you could have
go for it.
You could have a expert snowboarder that couldn't teach it at all because it's just, I do what works.
Yes. Yes. So this is to speak to the whole picture, which you're pointing to very accurately, is that sort of what I do with clients is born not just out of intellectual study, which it was a lot. I spent over 30,000 hours trying to understand these things. And I would say I went to the edge of the mind many different times to try to heal myself intellectually, which I realized like, oh, that doesn't work. And it just felt a lot easier to explore things at the level of the mind than it meant to actually do the work, the inner work, which was feeling all the pain of my inner child, to feeling all the trauma, all the fear, all the anxiety, all of the sort of chaos and dysregulation of my nervous system without running.
And how did you do
know,
that? Did you just do that through mostly meditation, or did you go to talk therapy?
Yeah, no, a lot of it was through all of the framework of self-knowledge. And so part of what we've been laying the sort of framework is to try to give a framework of some of this. And it's a much broader aspect. And most people like discover these things in like one thing. And then they start like, for instance, like I would say like lately there's been a lot of more interest in like cold plunging and sauna work and like different sort of somatic practices, sound bowl healing, all these stuff. These things are things that have been around for thousands of years. Like none of what we're actually sort of circling back around is sort of new. The difference, or at least I think the helpful thing, is like creating a framework of like when to use that, because like there's sort of seasons in healing. What applies for something in spring, right, in terms of like your garden, doesn't apply in winter. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's why it's a little bit tricky to sort of like give generic advice. It's not that it's not helpful. It's just not as helpful without a framework. And so a lot of like the conversation and discussion around like some of the stuff that happened when I was 19, just to touch on this before we go deeper, is that I sort of like, I had full-blown triggers, right? So I was triggered chemically, physically, mentally, emotionally. And I could not even go fill up my gas tank with having all these visceral reactions, with skin reactions, like feeling nauseated and ill. Like I couldn't process everything, and everything of the condition itself felt like a threat. I couldn't have a conversation without my nervous system going into a panic attack. So I was in 19, going into college and trying to navigate the nature of trying to raise your hand in class and having this huge visceral reaction of like sweating and panic attacks and like my voice trembling. All of these things were happening because the conditioned self was like, this isn't safe to express yourself, right? Because that's what I was conditioned. And then all of the trauma and stuff was like still in the nervous system. And so it was an overwhelming sense of like dysfunction, chaos. And so you don't know what you don't know. All you know is something is terribly wrong. And I think a lot of people go into these areas of healing thinking things are going to get better. And actually, they actually, I would say like the road to heaven feels like hell, right? And the road to hell feels like heaven, meaning the nature of using drugs and the nature of escape. Like you think you're avoiding it and you're getting away from it, but it just keeps building bigger and bigger behind you. And then to turn into it, which is the opposite way of evolution, right? To turn into our pain is the opposite of what our instinct is, right? That's what love is. Love is to sit in presence and patience and persistence until those portions of ourself have been felt, acknowledged, and reintegrated into our experience. And so these are all fundamental pieces that build on each other. And to answer from 19, where I sort of had this dark night of the soul, I had this point of clarity that led me to understand that like I needed to accept everything.
Were you like in a meditation when this happened?
No.
You're just...
No, I was in my bed. I clearly remember this. I was in my bed and sleep was getting worse and worse. And at this point, I had so many physical symptoms. And I was sort of like throwing up parasites, defecating parasites. Like I had all of these sort of like very strong physical and, I had rashes and skin issues from head to toe and just like all of this like accumulation. And through this like exhaustion was like this opening. Mm. And I realized like, oh, look, like I'm fighting all of this. There was some part of me that was fighting it. Like I didn't want this to happen. And I realized that like, oh, yeah, like I had to accept everything exactly the way it was so that I had any chance of like expansion. Because I was so contracted in the nature of chaos, which was like the furthest activation of the sympathetic nervous system fighting for its survival. And so like I always say, the paradox of the universe is you can't get to safety through protection. Mm. Right. So
you have to let go and accept all of it.
Yes. And so your surrender
And
is a surrender to yourself, surrender to the nature of experience, to what is happening. And acceptance doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean alignment.
Right.
I didn't agree with what was happening. I didn't necessarily align. Of course, I would choose something else. But I accepted it, meaning I stopped fighting it, because any level of resistance was not only magnifying it, but it was a reduction in the energy that could be going towards healing.
So
Right.
I think the key in that then is trust. So when you stop fighting and you accept what it is and trust that your body is innately designed to heal itself, and that it will, if you stop contracting and like forcing and
Yes.
basically yeah, I'm doing
Yes.
a terrible job
No,
at
you're doing
explaining, but
amazing.
you know
Yes.
what I mean. The trust part, I think, is a super important thing, because otherwise I'm hearing just stop caring if you're suffering, and people are like, wait, I don't want to suffer, but it's not stop caring. It's just accept where you are fully, and then begin to trust fully that your body's going to heal itself.
Yeah, I think, and these sort of granular understandings are really key to like tease out, because when we express these things, it almost feels like, oh, you're trying to like deny
Or
in
give
fact,
up,
yeah,
or
yeah,
Yeah.
it means it's giving into the nature of like what is, so that you can actually move beyond it, right? Like we can't ever really actually, if we try to reject what is happening, we can't move forward.
that is tricky.
And so it's like a matter of coming so close and honoring what is, so that whatever is can be processed and digested. And so it's like we understand that the nature of like our experience of suffering is happening, and there's a part of us that is cognitively or mentally trying to stop it, right? That is what the mind formation is. And the opposite of that is to sort of like recognize that the reason those things came about in the first place was because those were parts of our self that didn't have the opportunity to be connected and integrated within the formation of
expressed
the self,
yeah.
right? And for us to have an opportunity to reconnect there, it's like the body's cries for the full integration and development of the nervous system emotionally. And so that's what all those screams and cries and all this chaos is a result of. And so for us to like dissociate is to repeat a pattern that feels safe because it helped us survive. And for us to love is to do the opposite. That feels like we're doing the wrong thing,
Yeah.
but it's actually the way home.
So how do you lead people to be through this? How do you lead your clients through this?
Yeah, the way I lead my clients through it is meeting them exactly where they're at. And thankfully, because of the direct experience of this framework that developed me from basically going from as far of contraction as one could possibly experience in the human reality, where I was triggered by everything and everyone, to now experiencing where I've, essentially experienced what most people would consider as a liberated state. That word sounds quite wild. Back then I never would have conceptualized that reality could be pain-free emotionally, and that you essentially couldn't have triggers. But like a lot of times, like people want to get there, and like I didn't get there by actually wanting to be there. I got there by meeting myself where I was at. And so to speak to your point in terms of like how do I work with people who are coming to clinic, I meet them exactly where they're at, because any alteration of that is a rejection of where they're at and a further perpetuation of the very trauma that started it.
Mm-hmm.
We're taught like we need to be this role, we need to be this identity, and that we're sort of like, it's rooted in shame.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's rooted in rejection, and it feels normal because in many ways that's part of the conditioned self. It's at the furthest end of the lie, but the more we are exposed to a lie, it becomes truth. That's why marketers spend billions of dollars exposing us to something, because if it's familiar in the mind and you've survived it, then we know it's safe, at least from a mental model, right?
Right. So when you say meeting them where they're at, what does that process look like?
So essentially when they come in the clinic, I look at their sort of like primary processes that we are looking to deal with.
Meaning like, what are their symptoms?
So symptoms and signs in terms of an intake basically is like the framework in terms of, and their primary complaint. right? So I have people that come in the clinic that they really just want their physical pain to be resolved. And I sort of like meet them exactly there. Not every single person wants to go into the nature of their emotional pain.
Right.
And not everyone wants to sort of dig up everything from the past in order to get there. And it's not absolutely necessary for everything, right? I would say that it just depends. And the whole part of this process is creating a rapport and a trust, because it's not about me, it's about the person, and that person redeveloping a trust for themselves in terms of like, the reason you have that disconnect is because you were wanting to express a part of yourself emotionally, right? And essentially you couldn't. Meaning that there wasn't enough space or room, or you wasn't safe, and you realize like, oh, I need to shut that down and disconnect. And physical pain has a strong relationship with emotional pain, but not all physical pain is emotional, right? And so one of the tools I use is called the Newbie. It's a direct current device. And the methodology is called the NewFit, but it uses DC pulse current to mimic the same signal that our nervous system sends. And it uses mainly sensory afferent signaling to affect motor output, which is very, very different than the traditional electrical muscle stimulation like TENS units or eStim, which are primarily affecting the motor output, right? Which is sort of like a contraction of the muscle. And so this leads to like, if you affect an output, you can't possibly sort of heal. That the very nature of healing has to go to the base layer of the inputs to affect the outputs. And so physically, when people come in the clinic to help them orthopedically heal, sort of walk through the nature of the Newbie or the NewFit, and we go through a scan process to find where those neurological dysfunctions are present within the nervous system. Whether it's emotional or whether it's physical, most of the time we can make significant progress because, again, emotions are in the body somatically.
It's all connected.
Yeah. So, and by sending great degrees of DC current, and these are conceptual models, so they're not fully accurate, but models are ways to help us understand reality and to actually interact with reality. So it's about, at full intensity, about 250 times stronger than the normal signal we can send. So you could imagine, right, with a signal that's 250 times stronger conceptually, if you're doing corrective movements with that level, that, 4 repetitions may roughly be equivalent to 1,000 neurological repetitions, right? So a lot of the rehabilitation of both orthopedic pain or post-op surgery is dramatically altered. So on average, people have a 50 to 70% reduction in recovery.
Wow.
So whether it's ACL or hip replacement or knee replacement, and this isn't something that's like an outlier. This is something that's very consistent, repeatable. And it's because, again, the physical body is also wired for survival, right? So essentially, we're trying to reconnect to those portions, leveraging the nervous system, which is sort of the operating system of all of it. And the more we send that signal, the more it connects. And it recognizes, it can process that the trauma physically is not happening in this moment. And it can change the governors that get set in place as a result of that initial trauma, which is like neurological inhibition, a change in vasculature blood flow, a change in neurological output, meaning muscle strength. And by changing that, we start to progress the rehabilitation process very quickly.
Wow.
Right? And so that's more on the physical side of things. But I'm really looking at people from the standpoint of, emotional healing, spiritual integration, and then physical healing, but not just in terms of what we were talking about. We also walk people through a full genome mapping. So, and again, if they want to. I'm sort of the guide, that's all. You are your own healer. Anyone who tells you otherwise, just run as far as you can, because ultimately, essentially everyone is their own healer, and we're just looking for mirrors that help us guide back to that truth, right? And that's how I arrived at healing, was going through many different mirrors, both healthy and unhealthy, to arrive at the nature of absolute truth, which is wholeness and integration of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual on every single level. And so the genetic genome mapping, the genome is sort of like your whole, all of your genes. And genetics is sort of a page or a chapter or a paragraph outside of that. And that gives you the opportunity to sort of like focus in. It's a very much a sort of brewing ground of research. So back in 2000, I think 7 or 8, like the genome was like over $1 billion to map, and we're now like at $399. So you can see where technology has helped accelerate
That's
this
amazing.
process. It's incredible. And a lot of me putting the final steps in terms of my physical healing was this piece. So I talked to you about my emotional healing, spiritual healing, and integration and liberation, but my physical really came about by understanding these final pieces physically. I learned certain genetic variants that were contributing to all of this, that accelerated the expression of these things. So I had MTHFR, which is a methylation issue. I was homozygous for C677T, which essentially lowers your ability to methylate by anywhere between 60, 70% or so, sometimes a little bit higher. And then I had some what we call synergistic heterozygosity, and synergistic homozygosity, which is genetic variants that interact in the same pathways that contribute to a larger level of dysfunction. So you might have heterozygous for one gene and another gene, but together they start actually creating problems. Yes.
You know, what's interesting too is with the whole gene testing going on, it's a very hot topic. A lot of people are doing it. I think a lot of people are getting them, but not a lot of resources are helping them read or decipher what any of it means.
Yes, we're absolutely in the very, very early days of this. And I think, again, it's helpful. I would say, everyone has unique strengths that they bring from both direct experience and intellectual study. One of the things that's really helped me is basically being able to look at these things with a very in-depth understanding of both Western sciences, but then also retaking it and filtering it back through Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine models that really account for the whole.
Yeah.
And then understanding the nature of like how those pathways are affecting all of those layers.
Right.
Because we don't really have a super effective model in Western, because if you understand the language of Western language, it very much is definitive language. So each word in the dictionary is defined on its own.
Right. It's very black and white.
Yes.
And that is not what health is.
No.
It's not what
It's not what
It's
we
not
are.
what reality is. So the
reality
mind,
is,
again, is very binary, right? It's sort of like this or that. But reality is on a spectrum. And so a lot of the nature of understanding reality is a letting go of the mind and coming, because it's kind of like, if I were to give you the analogy that if you were to look at an elephant and be like, the mind represented the trunk of an elephant, and we're like, okay, we're going to study the mind and we'll absolutely understand the elephant. It's like no one would think that.
Right.
But that's what we think about the mind. We think that the truth is in the mind and that someday science is going to discover the truth. It's like, actually, that's not the case. It's actually the opposite of that. It's actually, to get to the truth, we have to let go of the mind to dissolve back into the whole. And then the truth is a lived experience of embodied wisdom and understanding. And that's what we're longing for. And with that, that question evaporates, right? The question of like, what is
Why
all
am
of
I
this?
here?
Why am I here? I mean, that only pertains if you're suffering emotionally, right? And so that nature is what many described as a sense of separation from the divine or a separation from the universe or some degree of things just not feeling the way they should.
Things feel off.
Yeah,
and you
things
don't
feel
know
off.
why. You can't put your finger on it.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
A little bit of a different subject. I mean, I'm just curious on the healing side of things. Was there anything dietary that you did or do you do with your clients to help them through their issues?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. The whole spectrum. So diet, I spanned the whole nature of diet.
I'm sure you tried them all.
Experimentation. And it's interesting because like I look at them now and then understanding these frameworks, I'm like, oh, I understand why they worked. And I think this is the interesting difficulty with a lot of people navigating natural health. And I get it. Like I've sort of been in this industry because of sort of the direct need to, and then also exposure from a young age from being in a family that was more oriented to this, that there's just this overwhelming level of information. and they don't know really how to navigate it. And there seems to be so much dogma that is sort of like presented, and it's natural, right? Dogma is sort of a result of the nature of tribalism, and tribalism is a result of survival. And so people get into their tribes of like this diet, that diet.
Yeah.
And it's because like you tried a diet and eventually it worked. It probably worked because of some of these mechanisms from genetic variants that and trauma and so forth, that it happened to take away some of the things that were causing a heightened level of inflammation in those particular areas that you're predisposed to. So you may have some issues in terms of like, sure, you have methylation issues, but then you may have some PEMT pathway issues, and you may have some issues with bioflow and so forth. And all of a sudden, like, you have parasites, you have all these things, and we're trying to resolve all of those things with a limited part of the picture, right? Like,
Right.
and so part of it is like, we are in sort of this generation of medicine where specialty medicine is glorified at an expense to wholeness. And the word healing comes from the word wholeness. It's literally derived from wholeness. So we essentially can't get to healing through subspecialty and specialty medicine. And yet almost everyone navigates medicine. They go to their physician and so forth, and they're almost always referred out to another specialist who refers them out to another specialist. And before it's just tagging, and no one's looking at the whole. And it's not to say that all specialty medicine is not healthy, or I should say, not all specialty medicine is not needed. It's just that specialty medicine should be a last resort, not a primary resort, in the same way that a lot of Western medicine is a bridge medicine. It's an emergency medicine that should be always utilized with a bridge to healing, which is to do with wholeness. It just doesn't happen to fit into the framework of reductionist medicine because they're looking at the smallest variable to fix the whole, which it's not a matter of like getting there. It's that the question formation is wrong.
And you're saying that the genome mapping, along with the other things we're discussing, like the emotional trauma processing part, but the genome mapping is a big piece of that.
Yes, the genome mapping is sort of where we know where your proclivity of predisposition and compensation is all disease and sickness. I shouldn't say all disease, but the majority of it is a compensation, right? It's a compensation that is necessary for survival. But what is necessary for survival isn't always necessary or helpful for quality of life, nor is it helpful for the nature of healing, but it's necessary for survival. And so when we look at the whole genome, we look at these genetic variants, if you have trauma, I can sort of see, I go back and I look at them like, oh, that's why. And so there were many different healing modalities in the natural health field that I did use along the way. And I realized like, oh, why it helped, like oxidative therapies and so forth. And yet at the same time, like I was like, well, you know, in many ways, if I would have had this level of understanding and knowledge of compensation, I could have supported those pathways from a biochemistry standpoint, like looking at the different supplements for individualized medicine, right? Like I would say that we're in the golden age of individualized medicine, which is genetic and genome mapping, which is to say like everyone is an N of one, right? Not only just from the nature of their experience in their childhood and the formation of the condition self, but because their genes are specific to them and their genetic variance is going to shape how they compensate inside in the same way that their trauma, emotions, and sort of somatic experiences are going to shape the nervous system and how that experience gives way, is that the biochemistry components are significant in terms of helping us understand why the person may be having the issues that they're having. The additional test can help us understand more of the current snapshot, which is like blood testing and metabolic testing. But it's kind of like the genetic and genome testing is like the operating system of your computer, right? It's like sometimes the operating system needs to be understood before you build more applications or test what is going on in the current environment, which blood work is really helpful at. So using metabolic and blood testing along with genetic testing can give us a better framework of understanding rather than just like constantly not knowing the first principles of your genetic variants. And of course, a lot of this is still being refined. over the nature of time. And so we're going to be exponentially clearer on some of the information and discussion that we're talking about today. But by mapping your entire genome, you can always run more and more genetic tests on it to extract where that data and the research is leading and give us a better understanding of supporting that side of the equation. If we can support the physical gives way to helping us process the emotional, psychological, and spiritual aspects of truth, right? If you're in relationship with someone and you try to bring up a difficult conversation and that person that you're bringing up the difficult conversation is very run down from the day, how do you think that's going to go, right?
Yeah, it's all about energy, right?
Yes.
Sorry about Teddy making some chewing over there. He found Velcro for the first time, and I think he liked the sticky part. Sorry, did you want to ask a question? Or
I thought you did.
I did, actually, yes, thank you. May seem like a weird question. We might cut it out from editing, but have you ever taken an IQ test?
No.
It seems like your IQ would be as high as the test can go. I'm having such a fun time and a challenging time, like
Keeping up?
keeping up. Yeah. Yes, exactly. But there was something that you said, and I wanted to clarify. It goes back to acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And you, previous to that, said a little bit about like, I believe you said feeling, like allowing yourself to feel the feelings, like all the feelings of the trauma.
Yes.
Is that what your definition of acceptance was?
So acceptance is essentially to be in a somatic state of non-resistance.
Okay, slow down.
So the
Soma
somatic
meaning
meaning
the
the
body.
body. So like, because this is like we use the concept acceptance to convey that word. The nature of experience underneath that word is basically, are you experiencing any resistance? Almost like what people would consider as stress, right? Stress is a form of possible resistance to what is. This is why stress is so fundamental to all sickness and disease, is that there's some sort of resistance, right, to what is occurring. But why is that resistance occurring? And it's because of experiences of the past and unprocessed emotions. And in order to essentially start to process the things of the past, we have to be in the present moment. You cannot, there is no past, right? I mean, we only have the present. We hear this all the time, but ultimately, in order to process the past, we have to be in the present. And so this sort of resistance is what leads to the nature of further dysfunction, further disease, and also further dysregulation of the nervous system, and thus a lower level of energy, right? A lot of this is sort of conceptualized through martial arts, right? And sort of the like Wu Wei, which was like the non-doing state. It was an explanation of experiencing the flow state 24/7 because you had accepted all things in reality exactly the way it was without resistance inside. And what that allowed you is the full range of capacity of the nervous system with any given moment, right? And in order to get there, though, we have to be able to accept what is right in front of us, because to get back there, we have to be with what is. And so much of the mind tries to jump forward and say, like, oh, I need to be this way. We reject what is happening in the body and in our experience now. And so much of the truth, at least for my own experience through this journey, was trying to discover it in the mind, only to result that it was so close I missed it. And in many ways, I would think that was part of the nature of like dissociation from the pain itself. I dissociated from the nature of the body because I felt like, oh, my body betrayed me, which most people, you always hear this, my body betrayed me. It's like your body actually can't betray you. Your body is where the truth is. The mind can lie, but the body cannot.
Okay,
and so it stores all of that in the body itself for later processing, because you didn't have the capacity to process it at that time, because the magnitude of your resources to process it wasn't ready.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the very nature of trauma itself, right? Trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens as what happens within you or as a result of what happens to you. Dr. Gabor Mate has spoken about this concept and understanding, and I think most people can relate to the nature of that. Siblings or other people go through the same experience. They don't necessarily have trauma, and that's because trauma is what changes within you as a result of what happens to you. I mean, at this point, the experience of anything outside in terms of stimuli and sensory doesn't affect the inside anymore. That's what liberation is this sort of internal stillness. So if I go to a Suns game or I go to sort of like, it feels like I'm meditating but I'm not. It's just a permanent state. It's a permanent shift in the nervous system.
And that's how you were able to go through your most severe physical breakdown without feeling
yes,
necessarily
100%.
You weren't suffering.
So to speak to the point that you're bringing up is that when I shared with you is sort of like this documentation where in November of 2023, I chose to go off of thyroid medication, partly because I had been sort of altering it along my healing journey, partly from an inquisition and inquiry standpoint that I arrived at this place where I was no longer suffering emotionally, maybe these things will just turn back on. At this juncture, I still was unclear about the sort of inborn genetic thyroid dyshormogenesis 6. But I thought hey, let's just see. And I was interested because as I started to alter the dose, anytime altering it, lowering it before, it would send me into depression, anxiety, which are just mechanisms that are designed to signal that there's something much deeper going on emotionally that need processing, right? We see those things as they're the problem. And it's not to say that they are certainly experientially felt as part of the problem, but really depression is a form of stopping you to go back inside and process what you didn't have the opportunity to process at which it occurred. And that's part of what I realized in my own experience, because normally thyroid hormone is really significant in the nature of depression or anxiety or psychiatric symptoms and so forth. And this is I don't think most people who experience liberation don't happen to have a thyroid. So this was one of the most insightful parts of my journey, which happened over the last sort of year, where I went off of it in November of 2023, and I sort of, again, had some interesting things. Obviously, didn't have any shift in mood, didn't have any emotional, which had already been going on. But then I was I could realize there was a lot of fluid retention, a lot of changes physically that were taking place. But my hope was okay, you've been on the medication for so long, you have to sort of give it an opportunity to allow those endocrine systems to sort of turn back on. So I was willing to and at this time I was meditating 18 hours a week. So I was with everything, and I could feel the physical sensations. But again, most of the suffering before was in the emotions and the mood. And I can tell you that people would sort of have a different experience of reality if that was a constant state. Not that that is the ideal state. It's not that it's just in a linear line. You have a deep sense of presence and connection and joy, but there isn't this sort of alteration of separation that was really an illusion, right? It's an illusion that's a felt experience, though. It's not it's like a magician, right? If he's doing a magic trick and another magician knows that magic trick, he can still enjoy the trick, but he's not fooled by the illusion. And so when these shifts happen, they're very visceral and somatic. And when I had the shift that I'm speaking to in April of 2023, leading up to that point, I had a huge amount of fear that was basically experienced somatically around my lower spine. And it was so intense. I was what is happening? And that happened for about a few weeks. And then I haven't experienced it since. And so that was, I think, the last finalization of the sort of conditioned self, the false self that was born out of survival, finally dissolving completely, and then returning to the sort of authentic true self, which was unchanged. And it wasn't like I was getting somewhere. I was coming back to the remembrance of that experience. And that's why we think something's not right. It's because this whole thing is a remembering of that experience of truth. That's why we have that inclination anyways, is people can sort of relate to that inclination, but you wouldn't have that if you didn't know that something was not exactly correct. So it has to be a remembering, right? And unwinding into this, not the other way around. And so from November 2023 all the way to September 7th of 2024, when I took those labs, I realized like, oh, I need to take these labs. I was sitting in a chair and I started to cough. And I was basically had fluid in my lungs from the buildup of having no T3, no T4, and a TSH of 420, which I took the blood work that next day. I was probably a week or maybe a few weeks from death. Like, it was myxedema coma for sure that led to the full-blown pneumonia.
Wow.
And I was still running a clinic. I was still doing all those things, but it gave me a deep insight into the nature of the self in terms of like how much energy, because remind you that those blood work was worse than that I had at 19 and 29, and I couldn't get out of bed. And we attribute so much of it to like, oh my gosh, it has to be like this biochemical imbalance. And it is. It's all biochemical.
Where in the body is trauma stored?
Yeah, so this is part of what was helpful about understanding the nature of Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. Is Ayurvedic medicine sort of gives us a helpful understanding in what they conceptualize as doshas, which have been shown to actually be pretty accurate in how the nervous system from individual to individual is sort of like either more sensitive or less sensitive in terms of sensory input. And they describe these conceptually as vata, pitta, and kapha. And from like things that may be more familiar to your audience is like body types. So like people know of the ectomorph, the mesomorph, and the endomorph. Those are body types.
Should we know this?
I was going to say, Ash, do you know this?
I
'Cause
don't.
I've never heard of it.
So they're
Those
kind
three
of like
types?
muscular builds, right?
Okay.
Ectomorph would be like very thin, very skinny. Mesomorph would be like more of a muscular build, kind of in between. And then an endomorph would be like a very, very large structure in terms of like larger bones, larger muscle, tend to carry more visceral fat. Not visceral, but just more fat in general. And so these body types interplay with the nature of like the, I would say, authentic self of expression. And we haven't talked a lot about the authentic self. We've been talking about the conditioned self, but like part of knowing the authentic self, at least from this standpoint, can be helpful. And we'll use dogs as a good analogy here.
Perfect timing.
So, yes, the nature of like a snow dog, right, is like a snow dog is like a working dog. It absolutely feels most alive when it is like engaged in like pulling a sled and working, and like its internal alignment and attunement is towards that behavior, right? And if it's not aligned with what it's doing, it's not going to be as healthy in its expression of what it's doing. And it has no sort of like the same conditions that a human has. Also, like a mastiff, if you put a mastiff, which is more closer to like this sort of endomorph or kapha type, and you try to make it a snow dog, it certainly will adapt to its best of ability, but it's not going to be aligned with how its intuitive sense is in terms of its nervous system and its natural energy systems to do that work. It's not. It's more of this like relaxed state of being. It's very chill. It has a very different way of experiencing itself. And so the closer we are to the natural self, and this is where Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine help us understand where trauma is in the nature of the body. So if someone has like a specific constitution in Ayurvedic, how is that constitution deviated from all the things that they haven't been able to process that's stored within the tissues of the body? And I would say that it is stored in the cellular memories. It is stored in the nature of the nervous system somatically. It is stored in the nature of the brain, and it is stored in the tissues and the fascia. And this is why, like, when people do somatic processing, which is part of healing, is that, whether it's massage or whether it's like somatic integration work, is that people will start to emote, right? The nature of emotions that are present within the body. And the Chinese medicine model helps us understand where those certain emotions will be mapped. So for instance, like the yang channels, which are basically just the way they conceptualize the body, is that the sort of gallbladder and the bladder, which has nothing to do with these Western concepts, are yang channels on the lower body that traverse both all the way from the foot to the head. They actually store all the excesses of emotions, because the yin channels are really very much what are the nurturing side, the restorative side, the rejuvenation side. And so they push everything into these excess channels. And so these excess channels tend to actually, for instance, the gallbladder tends to store a lot of excess of anger, or irritability, or frustration. You would say that in many ways that it is more representation of mirroring the stored trauma from a Western conceptual model of like sympathetic nervous system dominance, right? Like everyone can understand that every withdrawal from every single drug, whether it's pharmaceutical or whether it's a street drug that is mood altering, tends to accompany irritability, frustration, and that is because the nervous system is withdrawing from basically being abused, right? All of those formations of engagement of those are self-abuse. And we learn to be familiar with that simply because of our original trauma and the nature of that they deliver what we think we want only to give us more of what we don't want later on. And so to answer your question in terms of the nature of like where these things are stored, they're stored in all different aspects of the body. And in some ways, like the core of that is the digestive process, which would be in Chinese medicine more of the sort of Yangming Tai-Yin channels, which have to process all of life. This is why the microbiome and digestion has been such a hot topic, and most people are focusing in on these concepts because they seem to be so directly related to health. What I think people are somewhat missing is the fact that like these emotions that are unprocessed and traumas from the past are having a disproportionate effect on these physical processes more than anyone could imagine. And I would say that you can see this in some of the literature of long-term meditators. Their microbiome is entirely different than the average person who does not meditate. And I say the average person just because like most people aren't taught what meditation is or that it's even important and that it's like a necessity to process the past. And this is not to say that like meditation's the only thing, but I would say that like it's probably one of the most important things. I was going over a discussion with the founder of NewFit, Garrett Salpeter, who essentially, along with myself, has sort of been along a journey of optimizing health and so forth. And he had laid through the Whoop band all these different activities, including sleep optimization and, you know, meditation, and then breath work and cold plunging, sauna, and then supplementation. And at the top of that list, in terms of impact on recovery, which it scales based on the inputs, meditation was the highest by plus 8%. And what I had described to him at one point when I was having discussion was that meditation is basically like strength training to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve that is about 80 to 85% of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so if you can sit in silence and allow everything that's chaotic to just be, that's coming up, the chaos of your mind, the chaos of the emotions coming up to be processed, and just continue to breathe and be with it, you're strengthening the nature of the vagus nerve.
So you're saying just being quiet, not even listening to like a guided meditation?
Yeah, and most of the time, you know, people start wherever they need to start, and so a guided meditation can give people a framework of understanding. At some point, it's just like training wheels. You know, the training wheels are necessary until they're not, and so guided meditations can be very, very powerful. I know that Sam Harris has a Waking Up app, and he takes people through different meditations, and he has both, I think, more of the focus meditation, which I would consider like the contractionary meditations on attention. And then he has more of the expansionary ones where attention moves into awareness. This is called non-doing meditation. So you have a contractionary meditations and expansionary. These are concepts that I help to categorize so that people can understand that there's actually a whole spectrum of meditation. The final phases is to move into expansionary meditation ongoing. That is the actual resting state of non-dual awareness, which isn't something we practice. It's something we come back to. But of course, like someone could practice it and get into glimpses of it. And so then they're like, oh, wow, this is a different experience of reality. But I will say that the experience of non-dual awareness is the most normal and simple experience of reality. It's seemingly just the most basic thing. Like what's happening that feels so wild is what's happening inside of us as they experience reality. And that reality itself is super basic. It's that there's no chaos, right? When you're experiencing it without things inside moving through the past. Right? Or altering your lens of perception or your conditioning or activating your old trauma. Reactions are reactivations of emotions that are unprocessed from the past. So when you react, it's a trigger of something that is a wound in the nervous system that is still open, that gets touched, right? So if you have a wound on your hand and I go to touch it, you're going to bat me away, right? But if it's closed, you might let me touch it. You might tell me a story about it. And most of talk therapy is about changing the story, but the story was never the problem. Like I'm sitting here, I just told you
Your
my
relationship
entire...
to the story.
It's the pain, emotional pain that gets unprocessed from the story. By telling the story, it's a form of processing. So that's why talk therapy can be very beneficial.
To get it out. Yeah.
Because there's a point, I'll leave this with you because I think it's very fitting to the nature of the entire journey, is that like in one of the Gnostic Gospels, they basically speak to this particular verse where it's like, whatever is within you, if you bring forth what is within you, it will be your salvation. If you do not bring forth what is within you, it will destroy you. And I think this is the nature of healing, right? Is that whatever is within us, meaning the things that have happened from the past, that we have not been able to bring forth and bring attention to these areas, that fundamentally they will destroy us because they are meant to be reconnected with and reintegrated, and that you are worthy of that. Ultimately, a lot of healing is understanding that self-love is the most important thing, because like people have the hardest time with self-love. It's easier to love others. It's either easier to love your family. But when it comes to self-love, it's the hardest thing. So in the same way that like exercise, if you were to say, oh, I'm going to work myself up to, say, a 600-pound deadlift, anything in between that would become easy. In the same way that self-love, if you can do that, loving others is easy. Because there is no self. Meaning that the nature of this whole thing is a sort of self-realization. That's what the spiritual paths talk about, is that it's knowing thyself. It's a realization into the self. And real realization means to make it real, make it embodied. So that, of course, we know the concepts of like Don Miguel Ruiz saying, don't take things personal. And most people would say, oh, I try to practice that concept. But like, truthfully, I feel that it's personal. The reason it feels personal is because it's painful.
Right.
And so the key is to meet yourself where you're at, not to create a new conceptual identity of a spiritual ego and spiritually bypass those emotional feelings and say, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this. No.
Honor the feelings.
Honor it. Feel
so that it can pass through.
Yes, process it. Yeah. And that's where things get caught. Again, speaking to the nature of the content versus the actual consciousness, which is the projector, is that we can use religious or spiritual to actually practice the same consciousness that is creating our suffering just by shifting the content. And so we really should be less focused on the knowledge and more focused on self-knowledge until we have a grasp of those things in terms of our lenses of perceptions, our belief structures, our trauma, our experiences of the past, what our cultural beliefs, what our societal beliefs are, and have a deep inquisition and self-inquiry into that. And once we know that, then acquiring the nature of knowledge can be helpful, but it's limited by the nature of self-knowledge, because all of that can be distorted to be harmful to ourself and the nature of others. Because ultimately, if one is whole, our natural state is very joyous and very loving and very kind and compassionate, but those aren't things that we need to perform. Those are things that we already are.
So when we aren't that, it just means we're not.
We're in pain.
Yeah, we're in pain.
Yeah, we're in pain and we're confused, right? Is
Yes.
that, of course, we all want to be there because we all would long to be in the natural self. And I think this is like part of the nature of like, I think when you go through this process of self-knowledge and healing, the very nature of the pain softens you. It brings a sense of humility and understanding of this shared expression of experience of humanity. And it humbles us to the core because we realize like how much our pain is preventing us from being able to relate or connect to others. And as we heal that, we have a deep understanding of how others are in similar pain and similar states of confusion, and that we're doing the best that we can based off of all the patterns of the past that were shaped by not you, but other people. And the only way out is in and through. And so the first point is to take a sense of presence with what is happening and then full accountability, not that you are responsible or at fault to what is taking place, but you are accountable with what is happening now.
That's
right?
the acceptance part.
Yes.
I mean, you are truly a wealth of knowledge, and I would love to be able to share with our audience and our listeners, like, where is somewhere that they can we follow you on Instagram? Are you dropping these nuggets of truth like on a regular, or how can people stay connected or follow you?
Well, thank you. That was very kind of you. And, from what I have heard and both interacted from both of you in terms of all the things that you've created, have been on this same path of helping people heal and doing it so from the standpoint of likely direct experience and intellectual pursuits of understanding medicine and also understanding what is sustainable. And so I deeply appreciate, and I communicate some of these things through my account on Instagram called breakthroughperformance_rehab. And I sort of drop different aspects. I always say, like, speaking to what we were talking about today, is not all knowledge is helpful, but with enough understanding of the self that some of it is transformative, right?
Yes.
So I try to speak to the nature of these aspects within ourselves that we know to be true, just like everyone seems to know that there's something not quite right and yet can't quite verbalize or articulate it. And so a lot of this healing journey, at least for myself, where I went from 19 and mute, I had all of this sort of pain and unprocessed trauma and emotions that I had to process before I could communicate it.
Right.
Right? And I think we're all going through that process where we are trying to process this. Communication is a skill in itself. And so someone could theoretically go through the whole process, get to liberation, and not know how to communicate it. And that is just like in the same way a bodybuilder could actually become the best bodybuilder in the world, have no idea what he actually did, but he followed the principles. So the mind can't get you there, but a better map can certainly help you navigate it. And the framework of what we discussed today is in part that, is trying to give people a framework of understanding so that they can trust the process. And it's done so in a way to not be romanticized or to actually avoid the nature of being due diligent in your process of diagnostics from a Western standpoint or anything on the Eastern, but just know that a lot of these experiences are happening with perfect blood work, right?
Definitely.
And this is speaking to that side of the equation. And I think we're at this sort of pivot in this age where people can have access to these things so we can understand, okay, is it coming from this side? Can we look at the genome? Can we look? I tried to look at everything that was what we know to move into what we don't know. And a large of this is the unconscious trauma and nervous system dysregulation that took place as a result of both collective trauma and individual trauma within a lifetime, and this concept of the conditioned self or the egoic structure that gives way to our experience of suffering and stress emotionally, and then gives way to physical onset of symptoms and signs that are all interdependent and intradependent and yet independent at the same time. And so they're all different layers there interacting simultaneously, and trying to tease apart this can be quite tricky and quite challenging.
Yes. It is a lot, but it's really important work. And I just want to say thanks again because you are doing amazing work for people, and you're helping a lot of people to heal. So thank you for spending your time with us today. Patrick, did you have any other questions?
Final question. If you wrote a book, what's the title of that book?
Yes. So if I were to write a book on all of this,
The story of your life.
Yeah. So, I mean, the book title would be Devotion, One Step at a Time. And the subtitle would be a sacred journey and walk through occult, sexual trauma, physical illness, and triggers into experience of truth and liberation.
Well, you certainly could write a book, and if you did, I would buy it.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you to say. Yeah.
Thank you again, and we have had an amazing experience just chatting with you today. This was awesome.
Dr. Wes Kress, thank you for being on the Rock Bottom Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ashley and Patrick. It's been just a wonderful time. I can really receive all of what you've done and what you've created in terms of this platform. And I know it's coming deeply from your heart and allowing people to process the things of what leads them there. I think the Rock Bottom Podcast is very fitting to the nature of what we discussed today in terms of allowing people to openly process things that they maybe are still in the active pursuit of working through.
Right.
And integrating and healing. And you guys have a beautiful presence and have done a lot of work yourself on many different layers. And I think you're perfect for allowing this on a broader scale for people to have the opportunity to do so. So thank you.
Thank you. And like the slogan says, it's fun to feel good, and that's what we're all after.
Yes, exactly. It's the remembrance of that experience.
That's right.
Yes.